I'd like to invite the panel to come up and take a seat. And I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to have a bit of a chat about education and transformation. And by the way, this isn't just about the book, this is broadening it out to talk about transformation generally. And the panel is, of course, Professor Pasi Sahlberg, who we heard speak so eloquently earlier, Peter Howes, who is principal of Murwillumbah High School, Jayne Muir, who is deputy at Hurstville Public School, and Leilana Levy, who is a second-year student at UTS. Please make them welcome. Okay, so I'm going to start with Pasi, and we're going to ask the question. You kind of threw out that provocation about how we work at a system level. From what you've seen in Finland and what you've seen in all over the world, really, in your travels and your thinking and your observations, what is it going to take to transform education systems in the way that you're suggesting?
That's an easy first question. Do you have any other questions, Michael?
Do you want to tell us about rock and roll?
A little bit later, after 8. Yeah, well, you know, this is how I think about this thing. That, as I said earlier, that we are dealing with a very complex thing. You know, changing a complex system like school, or let alone education system that is made of many of these complex units, calls for a simple way of thinking. And this is what I would like to offer. If you want to be successful in change in general, or transformation, as you were asking, Michael, I think we need 3 things, and 3 things only. They're easy to say, but very hard to do. And the first thing is, of course, that, I would argue that what I've seen around the world is that this is often the weakest link of all of these 3 things, and it's understanding what is the problem right now. Okay, so why do we need to transform things? And if we are not aware of what is the problem, what's the point of doing anything? So that's why we need to start with this thing that what are the issues? Why do we need to change? Why do we need to want to transform anything? And to do that is a hard thing. Remember, Einstein said that if you give me a complex, difficult problem and 1 hour to solve that, I would spend 55 minutes to understand the problem, and then I would work in 5 minutes the solution. But in education, we often work exactly the other way around. That we think about 5 minutes, and then we struggle the remaining 55 minutes in this thing. So that's why it's critically important. The second one, it is equally important in this process, but probably a little bit easier technically to do, is to have a vision, the dream, where do we want to go? And that's why these values are so important to do. But if you don't have a vision, people say that if you don't have an idea where you want to go, any road will take you there. And that's why it's a critically important. It's a hard thing to do with 1 school, and it's even harder thing to do with 2,200 schools here in New South Wales, so that everybody would kind of buy into this vision and say that I understand what it is, I'm ready to work for that. That's what I'm talking about here. So now we have these 2 things, and then the third one, of course, is to figure out what's the best theory of change to get from here to there, okay? And that's where the science steps into the picture, and your work and many others in this room. But it's simple like this. What's the problem? Why do we need to want to transform? Where do we want to go? And what is the way to get there? And if we figure out these things, life is going to be easy. but that's in this room we have teachers and principals and scholars and parents and many others. We are all needed in this thing. That we cannot leave these 3 things to be done by any one group of those that I mentioned. So that's why I hope that this helps all of us to think about this kind of a simplicity of this thing, but at the same time the complexity of getting these things done. But your book is a kind of a great help for finding ways to how to get these things done.
I think some of what you're saying I totally agree with, and some I don't, but we'll talk about that later. Because, and you know more than me. Look, at Murwillumbah, I think when I came into the space, it was the epitome of the problem. And the problem is, to me, compliant dependency. And that is nothing that anybody in the school, whether they're staff or students or parents, want to be, but they're just not aware. And we're not aware because we're from a system. So compliant dependency, of course, is tell me what to do. Just tell me what to do. Give me the answers, says Alison. You know, tell me how I think. Tell me what to do. And within the schooling system, we inherit what those have done before us. And as an old drama teacher myself, I used to teach Theatre of the Oppressed, and Augusto Boal talks about this concept of the cop in the head, that sense of the subconscious, I can't see beyond that. And that's what we get again and again in schools, and that's what I saw at Murwillumbah. You know, why aren't we getting the traction? We can see the data's not there to support where we want to go, but nobody wants to own it. No one really wants to drive it, and the creative thinking's not there. So from that, I think that what we need to do is, you know, what I've done and we've done as a team is get people to critically reflect. You know, why? Really why? And we read about that in a couple of the books, because that's the thing that's going to shake up that compliant dependency. But it needs brave leadership. It needs people within schools who are going to give permission to the rest of the school and build a culture, it's cultural leadership around the risk-taking. Michael, you talked about that. I kind of disagree with the system down approach. You know, talking to Peter Langstraat, who was a director in Alberta, and he talks about the success of that system was because it was school by school and leader by leader, and the work that we do is to build that capacity of the staff and the students to see what's possible.
Can I just
Yeah.
But this is...
It's on.
This is exactly what I was saying. It was not the system down approach. The beauty of Alberta Initiative for School Improvement, or the Finnish transformation in 1990s, was exactly this. It came from the actors, not from the top. Excellent. Good. So now we agree.
Thank goodness we're all agreeing again. Hooray.
You can go home. And me too.
So, Jayne, we've been working with Hurstville for, I feel like it's been about 40 years, but it's probably been about 40 great years. When you're thinking about a primary school setting, is there much difference in kind of transformation? Is it something that kind of comes naturally, or what's been the journey at Hurstville, and can you reflect on maybe some of the things that Peter and Pasi have talked about there?
Absolutely. I suppose to give you some context, Hurstville Public School, we're in south of Sydney. We've got over 1,100 students at our school, from kindergarten to year 6. We have 4 opportunity classes for gifted and talented students. We also have 4 classes of students in our support unit, children with an intellectual disability. So when you look at our school, we've got a huge scope of obviously students, and we've also with our staff. We've got 96% of our children come from a non-English speaking background. And I suppose for you, when you spoke earlier, Pasi, about identifying the problem, I think for us, when we began this journey, when you looked at Hurstville Public School, the data showed that we were a high-performing school. Many people want to go to our school. They like to lie to try and get into our school. They'll pretend they live somewhere to get in. So we are a very high-performing school. But for our staff, we were sitting back looking at our kids saying, do you know what? Yes, they can perform in a test. Yes, our results are showing that our children are performing. But when we're looking around that classroom, the kids are not creative. If it's not written down on a piece of paper and it's following this structure that the teacher's setting out, they don't know how to be creative. They didn't know how to collaborate. The communication was falling down within the school. So I suppose for us, when we started working with Miranda and yourself, you brought into the space scaffolds that we could draw on. So we used the 4 Cs, we used the learning disposition wheels, and we actually applied that in the classroom with our kids and broke those scaffolds down into our teaching. We also brought it into our leadership, like we were talking about earlier as well. Adults find it hard to collaborate. I know a lot of you are sitting in the room. We've all sat in meetings when we've thought, okay, let's all work together. And then you get those people who just sit there and think, I'm not going to work with you. I'm not interested in offering what I want to say. So we even had to work with our staff about how to collaborate. So I do agree with you. It's finding the problem. And I think for us, the hardest thing for people was to be able to say, well, what is it going to look like, which we have talked a lot about. And a lot of people have come into Hurstville Public School to come and see what we are doing, and they're saying, what does it look like? What are the answers? What do we do first? Then what do you do? But for every school you go into, that journey is different. And if you give people the answers, then that's actually taking away the creativity and the scope that they could have within that setting.
Yeah, and we often say that we've got 60-odd schools, not to suggest that they're odd schools, but because every school is different. And that's the problem with the rollout mentality, I think, you know, that we see so much in schools, that we just roll it out like everything's the same, but it's really a kind of a steamroller approach. You're rolling everything into the same flat kind of constitution. I think that's a really interesting thing about Hurstville. Hurstville and Murwillumbah are completely different places, contexts, cultures, and yet similar frameworks, similar approaches, similar understandings can work. I know that you visited Hurstville recently. What stood out for you when you looked, and why would you be looking at a primary school? You're a high school.
Yeah, well, there's a few reasons, but look, it's not about whether you're primary or high school. It's about the learning, isn't it? And
that's the right answer, Peter. Yes. Well done, Peter.
So that's my second exit. Yeah, and you talked about that sense of steamrolling, rolling out the system, but what you're doing is you're rolling over people and their independence and their agency, and the students, you know, they're the answers, and the staff are the answers, and the leaders are the answers. And that was one of the hardest things we had to do in Murwillumbah, was work with that leadership team to get them to collaborate, but also to see that it's possible, that it's okay to take those risks, that it's, that there is no wrong. And yes, you can imagine outside the box. So we went to Hurstville as a high school to see the work, not to look at the primary curriculum or be restricted by any of those things that we think of in teacher education, and which is part of the problem. We went to demonstrate that kindergarten kids, to our staff and other staff who came with us from other schools, kindergarten kids can do the work as well as Year 12 kids, and they can probably do it better. And walking away, it was really interesting. There was a group of staff from another primary school that came with us from our area, and they saw a classroom in action and some of these amazing teachers running some 4C style activities, and the agency in the room was palpable. These kids, they knew their protocols. It was a Year 2, 3 group. There were 60 kids in the double room, and they were humming. There was not one kid off task, and the relationships were there, and you wouldn't believe what we saw. Well, I did. But on the way out, some of the primary staff said, but Peter, surely that was just staged. Kids can't be like that. And that's the problem. That's the compliant dependency. That's the cop in the head. We don't give them permission. We don't know how. We don't give ourselves permission as teachers, as leaders.
And just to build on from that, the staff from the high school came over and they said, oh, how many times have they practiced that lesson? And I said, no, that's what they were actually, that's an authentic lesson. And I said, but you don't understand the learning that's gone behind that. That scaffolding of that lesson has been building throughout the year. You could walk into that class tomorrow and it would be authentic. But yes, they did think it was rehearsed. It was pretty amazing though, wasn't it? It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, Hurstville is pretty amazing. So if you're online or if you're in the room, please feel free to think up a question, because I've got some really boring ones. I'd love your interesting ones. If you want to ask a question in the room, please come down to the microphone so Zoom World can hear you. If you're on Zoom World, just post your question into the chat box and we'll ask it. But I want to turn now to Lana. Now, Lana was at Turramurra High School 3 years ago, I want to say, 2 years ago.
I graduated in 2019.
Yeah? Okay. I'll give you this one in a second when I've stopped talking, respecting your agency. In terms of what you experienced when you were at Turramurra, the 4Cs work was in full swing there. How has that prepared you for what you're doing now? You're in second year UTS and you might want to tell everyone what you're doing, and what have been the connections for you?
Yeah, so I was probably introduced to 4C style learning in about year 9 or year 10, and I think I just fell in love with it really quickly because I felt so stimulated and exciting by all of this really deep learning. And like, I thought it was really interesting before when we were talking about leadership and one leader leaving and then the school struggling to keep up that transformative momentum. Because in my experience, the teacher who influenced my learning the most left the school, and then I felt that I wanted to be more involved in leading the school, so stepping in.
Why was that?
Because I just saw the value that 4Cs had to make learning really deep and meaningful. So now I'm at UTS, I'm studying a Bachelor of Communications and a Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation. And in terms of how my high school experiences with the 4Cs have influenced my learning in those degrees is very different, because the BCII is super transformative, super rich in pedagogy, but the communications degree is really lacking. And so it's been a major test, I think, of my own agency and facilitating my own learning in that environment.
Mm.
Yeah.
And when you look back to that, that learning, what's been the most critical thing for you? Like, is it the agency? Is it the collaboration? What's been the most important thing for you?
Well, I think like a lot of the different elements in the scheme is, I still come back to them all the time. Probably grit as a disposition, I think, is something that I come back to time and time again. Like, even though I think of myself as like quite an agentic student, there are so many times where I've been in a Zoom and just completely tuned out, doodling.
Yeah, no one else here said that, yeah.
But then just every now and then I remember that I have all of these tools in my own learning. Like, I have these pedagogical tools. I know how to facilitate my own learning, and I just have to remember to do that for myself. Like, no one else at the moment is doing that for me in my degree, so I have to, be my own teacher. So
knowing about that disposition sets you up to learn better in an independent way and a collaborative way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, thinking, back to focus, like being self-regulated, being motivated, that requires so much grit, I think, in this situation.
Yeah, great.
Michael, I just want to stem off that, and the example at Mooloolaba High has been, I think we're up to year 9 now, seriously in terms of the dispositions and the schemas and working with those students intensively. It's not as though we're not working with the older ones, but we've really poured the energy, start from the beginning, because it's so hard to change those old patterns. There is chalk and cheese between the capacity of the students in year 7, 8 and 9 compared to 10, 11 and 12. Their agency is just off the scale, and their abilities to pick up and drive things and collaborate and be invested in the school governance, which is sounds a bit boring, but they make it exciting, and rethinking and reimagining schools, they're driving it. And and you're testament to where they're going to go, hearing you talk and thinking about where they're going to go in university. It's really amazing.
So we've got some questions coming in on Zoom, none live yet. So, this is your chance, it's your big chance. The question that's come up twice, actually, is from Megan West, our old friend Megan West, and seconded by Hannah Granger-Clemson from Belgium, one of our longtime friends. Megan asks, how can we do this without teachers perceiving it as more work and just another trend? And I'm going to throw this to you, Jayne. And then Peter can follow up and anyone else can throw in. And Hannah says, I second that. This is a huge issue at the moment over here. The pandemic exhaustion is so much change as shock, has increased the resistance to change we are hearing. I don't know if that's a factor that you're finding, but how do we make it not feel like extra work for teachers, or is that not the framing?
That was loud. It's always going to be an issue, I'll be honest. We've been working now for 4 years and there are still staff members who think it's something extra that they have to do. But I'm a firm believer of building the capacity of people and getting the critical mass across the line. If you can get a large amount of people on board, it sort of sparks some curiosity and some interest in other people. I think there's power in always being creative and rethinking what it's going to look like. So when we started doing our professional learning with the team, the first step was agency, just getting them in the door, making them responsible for their own learning if they didn't want to turn up because, they just happened to have a doctor's appointment that day and they had to leave early. As much as that became frustrating, at the same time, if they weren't prepared to walk in the door and focus on this, then that's back on them. I also believe that the power is always rethinking and reimagining what it looks like. So once you get through the professional learning suite of modules that you need to do, the thoughts were, I'm done now, that's it, tick. No, it's not actually about that. Now what do we need to do now? So then we sort of went back into the school setting and thought, right, well, now we've done all this learning, what are we going to do in our classrooms? So reimagine what that could look like, collaborative planning days, getting together with a group of people with a big piece of paper and saying, do you know what, let's throw out that program that we wrote 4 years ago for the students who are now in high school. Let's put away that program that someone downloaded from Butterfly Wings that don't even know what the children in my classroom look like. Let's go back to basics. And when you actually think about the students and their learning and how you can authentically engage those students, that's when you're going to start to see the shift. If people don't know what's possible and don't have the courage to go in and give it a crack with your cracking book, that's on them. But I don't think that's enough reason to say it's going to be all too hard. And I think for us, COVID, the one thing that I think COVID taught Hurstville Public School is that overnight, we had to rethink the way that we teach students. We had our stage 3 students were working with an online platform called Shobi. That was it. And they had iPads. We had all these children working from home and we had to do online learning overnight. And we got 1,115 children on Seesaw in under a week. We upskilled our teachers about how we can authentically teach these students. So it takes courage, it takes bravery. And I think for the people who aren't on board, it's that sense of loss. And I think change for many people is loss. So when you're saying to them, the way you've always done things, that's great, but what could we do now? That's on them. And I think it's the power in the people. I mean, I used to say all the time, come on, give it a crack. Come on. Prove me wrong. I'm a massive believer. Prove to me that it won't work. Prove to me that you can't have those children in your room working together. If you can prove me wrong, perfect.
So, Peter, just kind of jumping out of what Jayne's saying, are there things that teachers have to stop doing and schools have to stop doing?
Yeah, absolutely.
To make space?
Yeah. Thanks for loading the gun. So, yeah, this is my passion. Firstly, there's this push and pull, isn't there? Because as teachers, we all of us understand agency and all of us want to do this work, but we're stymied by the system, by the New South Wales or wider New South Wales Department of Education, and that, you know, sense of heavy-handed responsibility and accountability that comes down, and it creates a sense of fear. And it takes bold leaders to stand up and say, look, you know what? I've got you covered. But what about the dot points in the syllabus? No, I've got you covered. You know, and it takes creativity to reread the Education Act and to reread the syllabuses and to reread the ACE manual from NISA and not look for what I can't do. And as Mike Saxon from Liverpool said, it's what can I do? And find what we can do and shift that thinking from the leadership, and then the staff and the students begin to say, hang on, what can I do? What's possible? So that's my first response to that, and that's why it's so important, isn't it, for the schools to, as I said earlier, Pasi, but you disagreed with me, for the schools to do the work. So there's that. COVID was such a gift for our school and moving things forward and getting our staff on board, because we noticed that students who weren't submitting work, weren't engaging particularly well in face-to-face, were thriving in the COVID environment. And we had to ask ourselves, why? What's going on? We knew the system was sick, we didn't realise it was that sick. And these are human beings. And Yong Zhao in a Zoom recently said to me, what knowledge is worth destroying a student's confidence? And it dropped on us during COVID that that's exactly what the system is doing. That's exactly what we were doing as a school. And there's no bigger motivator than seeing the damage on kids to change things. But conversely, to seeing, when you give them an opportunity, how amazing these kids are. From that experience, we've embedded in our timetable student-directed learning time, where students get to do whatever they want in a supported way with learning coaches. Every student now, 7 through to 10, I can proudly say, has an individual education plan about their goals. You know, we did all sorts of great things. Got my deputy Luke here, and we could go on and on and on forever. But the students come to executive meetings, they make key decisions, and all of these things were driven by the school captains coming back after COVID, and we sat down with them and said, what are we going to do? This is terrible. So it takes bravery, it takes the capacity to have risk, but you've got to also honour the fact that staff are terrified. That you're saying to me that I've got to change the way that I've been doing things, but the win is they've always wanted to do it this way. That's the reality. That's why they became teachers.
So I'm going to come to Pasi in a second, because he's just written extensively about teachers. But I want to ask Lana, is it worth it? Like, from a teacher's perspective, you've been a student in this classroom, that teacher that you talked about. Like, was it worth that teacher changing that practice for you?
100%. But what I really like to talk to is like when you were just saying, sorry, I think that's kind of...
Shut up, Michael, I've got something more interesting to say.
It was just a bit of a self-explanatory question, obviously.
Yeah.
What you were just saying about trying to find room within a system. So in year 10, I worked really hard on this reflective learning journal, and I came to exactly the same conclusion as a student. Because in some classes, you know, we had this really authentic, deep learning experiences, and then in others, I just felt really, really stifled. And what I wrote in my reflective journal was that I needed to make sure my perspective was not like focused around leading with anger and being like, screw the school system. And then instead it was like, you know, work this system, like figure out how I can take back control, how I can make this meaningful to me.
Much better answer than I did in physics, you know. So Pasi, you have a new book called In Teachers We Trust, and Tracy's got a question, so brace yourself. So Can you speak to, I mean, one of the things that we've always said is teachers and students are our best resource for transformation. Do you think that's true, or in terms of the kind of, is it worth the trouble kind of question, what's your take on that for teachers?
Yeah, just 3 words, read my book.
Not on sale this evening.
No. But we can get back to this, but I would really love to hear what the audience has to say.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, everybody. How are we all? My provocation is around, and Peter and I have had a lot of conversations around this work, and my provocation is it is the work, that if you can't fit every learning intention into the blue of that learning disposition wheel, then are you really teaching anything? And I think my provocation is, how do we engage this lovely young lady in every classroom, in every lesson, through her helping us to lead the learning that happens in every classroom? And one of the things that I did as the brave and courageous leader was ban tests in Year 7 and 8.
Mm. Okay, any thoughts on that provocation? Well, we're not provoked, we think it's fair enough. Okay, that's fine by me. We'll charge on. So, a couple of things that are coming up on Zoom. Someone says, if I don't get the feeling, sorry, this is Kate Maslowski, I don't get the feeling in my environment that teachers don't want to change, or even the leaders. It's more about having the capacity to change with the restrictions that are placed on teachers with meeting data requirements, targets made by the department, etc., etc. How do you respond to that when it's teachers are saying, actually, this is what I got in the game for, this is why I'm doing it, and yet all of these restrictions are stopping me from transformation?
The steamroller, and that's the great problem we face. You know, this I think, Robin, did you describe it as a retrograde discourse of education? I think they're your words. I don't know, but close to. You know, and I feel like we're going backwards as a system, and I know my director's in the Zoom here somewhere, and so forgive me.
For what you're about to do, yeah.
Yeah, look, you know, our system is ill, if that's our thinking across Australia and in New South Wales, around expecting data and targets. But my answer is this, and she knows this because we've had lots of conversations, and I think she agrees with it. If we do the work, the rest will come. It's about shifting your focus away from that rubbish. Well, it's not really rubbish, but shifting your focus away from that to the real work, because you're not going to get there unless you're dealing, engaging your students in the intrapersonal and interpersonal, and unless they're engaging us in interpersonal and intrapersonal. That's what schools are about. You can Google the blue stuff most of the time. It's not as though that's not important. And that's a simplistic view of what the blue quadrant is. But I think we need to shift our focus in the way we interpret it. There is still time and place for data and targets.
I think the more time I spend around teachers, the more I notice how much these sentiments are like echoed in students, that there's this frustration with, like you were saying, tests and all of these like pressures. But then there's this like also big fear that, oh, how am I supposed to get good marks on my HSC, or all of that kind of thing. I just think that's a really interesting tension that it reflects.
So it's interesting. I don't worry about that because I just think I'm not going to be able to change that. So why should that stop me? I think that's probably the way I look at it. So I'm all about the practice. So if I have to have a certain number of students reading in the top 2 bands and that's my target I've got to get to with the whole school, well, how am I going to get there? I'm going to get there through the practice. And the practice in the classrooms should be sitting side by side with the curriculum, with the 4 Cs. How am I going to engage these students? Because that's where I'm going to see the results. Giving a child a piece of paper and asking them to do a page of maths algorithms, or every child in the classroom using the same textbook, those days are long gone. We've got to be differentiating our learning and our teaching for our students. You will see the results in these authentic. So I actually struggle with that question because I don't think it makes a difference. I think that's just something that we have to do. We're not going to change that.
Yep.
What can we change? We can change the practice and you will see the results.
Yep.
One question on that I ask staff is, what is a great learner? Because a great learner will get great results in all of those things. If we teach, if we work with our learners to be great learners, it will come. And that's that shift in focus.
I think probably my best example I could think of, and Rebecca Ingram's in the room, she taught this child with me, and he was into getting to selective high school, he was the smartest child in the state, and he was in my class. Now, he was incredible. He could recite pi to over 1,500 places. He would learn the most incredible, amazing things that meant nothing to me, but meant a lot to him. But that child could not look me in the eye in the morning and say good morning to me. That child could not sit in a group and work in a group. He didn't know how to collaborate. He didn't know how to communicate. So my goal was to have him, by the end of the year, come up without me prompting and to say, see you later, Mrs. Muir. That was my goal. And every day I would say good morning to him. I would look him in the eye. Every afternoon I would do it, every day. And I would sit there, and he eventually did. It probably took me 3.5 terms, but that child eventually came up to my face, looked me in the eye and said, good afternoon, Mrs. Muir. Winning. That, to me, was my goal for that child. He also never, ever liked to work with other students. He was so intelligent and he thought so differently that everyone in the room was actually insulting to him in a way because they weren't working at the same level that he was working at. So the conversations I had with him were about the fact that, do you know what, buddy, you eventually in life, you're going to have to work with someone. We're going to have to think about the fact that before we start working, everyone's going to have to offer something. Everyone in the group's going to offer something, including you. And you may not like that. That's okay. You have the opportunity to yield. You have the opportunity to give your opinion. But you can't always be working on your own. Now, he hated it. So we used to negotiate. We'd have a week worth of collaborative activities and I'd say, okay, Monday you can work on your own. That's okay. That was his perfect day. But he knew that on Tuesday, I was going to say to him, come on, we're going to work in a group. And it's slow steps. And I think that's the thing that I love the most about your work is the fact that it gives the teachers the steps, the scaffolds to actually teach those explicit strategies and life skills to the students.
Yeah.
I'm not going to ask a question.
Yeah, so like talking about all of this, like the learning will come. I think, like I said before, you know, some classes were really engaging and then others were really lacking. But because I was developing skills in harnessing my own learning, I was able to transfer that, say, to my maths class where, you know, I would be so frustrated trying to work on these problems and the strategies I was being given weren't helping at all because that was just go through the textbook exercises. But then, like, for example, being able to start playing with possibilities in a really difficult question just helped my learning. And yeah, that comes back to the transdisciplinary elements because I was growing as a learner, not ticking the dot points.
Okay, this is the last call for live questions in the room. We've got a couple more online. We've only got one versus like about 10 online. Thanks, Robin. I can see I have Robin's coming in to ask a question and not go somewhere else. That would be very embarrassing. So a question from Michael Finneran from Ireland, who actually asked before the launch whether he could be couriered cheese and wine, and we arranged that for him. Nobody else online asked on this occasion, so no one else got cheese and wine. Michael Finneran, sorry, I know him by Finneran. For those of us working in international contexts, what's the best lesson that we can learn from Australian schools at the moment? Pasi. Try and make it positive.
I'm working hard for that. Well,
Maybe we'll start with Peter.
let me think. I'm sure I'm going to find one thing, but let me think a little bit.
Okay.
I think the essence of the Australian curriculum is pointing to this work. And that's we're on the cusp as a system to move there, but people en masse are kicking and screaming, and systems are kicking and screaming against it. But I think that if you can have a set of curriculum writers who acknowledge that the intrapersonal and interpersonal skill set need to be explicitly taught and learned, I should say not taught, but need to be learned, is a great lesson.
Yeah, now I have an answer to this difficult question. You know, of course, this is, like everybody here probably knows, that we are in a country where the systems don't have too much to show to the world. It's very difficult to find something that I would take as a systems element or aspect of the education, any of these education systems here. But I would say this, and this is something that my colleagues and friends around the world have been asking me, and I always say that, you know, some of the most inspiring and interesting schools, individual schools that I've seen anywhere in the world are here. Your school is one. I went to Dennis's school. It's a beautiful high school doing wonderful things, and many others. So I think that, you know, if you want to learn something from Australia, my advice would be, don't pay so much attention to the system policies or kind of a thinking over there. Go and see the schools and find those schools and learn from them, because they are amazing places here. And then there are, of course, amazing individuals leading these schools and teaching in these schools and working with these schools here. Unlike, you know, I can say that you know, I haven't seen some of those schools back home in Finland that, you know, many people think that it has the best schools in the world, but that's not true. The system is probably one of the best systems in the world, but it doesn't mean that your schools would be the best schools. But
that's
here,
a great point, actually.
Yeah, but here you have the kind of this interesting stellar schools that you have. It's just amazing. So if somebody would come to Australia and wants to see learn something, I would definitely take these people to see the individual schools and what they do, how they try to kind of survive in this climate that you were, Peter, talking about, the compliance and pressure and crazy expectations, but still doing wonderful things. You know, that's a lesson to learn that people can take away from here.
Robin.
I certainly agree with that. There are lots of teachers who are finding the places and spaces to play, and they have for a long time. But I actually, it's not really a question, although it has a question within it. I also think there is another piece to this puzzle, and that is about changing the discourse in the community more broadly, and sometimes with parents. You know, I think over my generation of being a teacher, there has been a change in the way teachers are looked at. I think actually COVID did something to start addressing that, because a lot of parents were so impressed and so in awe of what teachers do every day. But their work has intensified so much, so that so much of their day is sometimes spent, you know, having to report a child who's disclosed something, making a report about something else, entering data, etc. And the rhetoric out there is often, and it's been from our prime ministers as well, that, you know, if your child hasn't done well in NAPLAN, go and talk to your teacher. They're at fault. Not understanding that poverty and so many other issues in the community are responsible and can really change things. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and I'm sure you've been doing it in your parent community and more broadly in the communities that you work in. And certainly that's been really evident to us in the work that we've done with parents in school drama. And they then can make changes in the community. And I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle that we also have to find time for, because every day in the media and so many other places, teachers, principals get bashed. And so many are under stress and they can't do what they know is right. And I think we have to get mobilised and start advocating in the systems and in the government kind of circles, in a sense, because I believe that while I agree completely, teachers can change this. We have to support them because there's so much, as you say, compliance and learned helplessness because of the way they're being treated.
Thanks, Robin. What's your take, Peter and Jayne, on what Robin's just said around the community/parent kind of piece of this?
I'm keen to hear what you're going to say, Jayne, but I mean, yeah, a couple of things. Firstly, in doing the work, one of the hardest things, and perhaps an error in leadership, is that we didn't involve the parents enough along the way, and they're the hardest ones to get to understand the work, particularly those of a higher socioeconomic who might have the expectations that, say, their child is in an academically streamed class, which we don't have anymore, thankfully, in our school. You know, that they're going, but that's all well and good to teach them all that fluffy stuff, but what about the dot points in the syllabus, and why aren't they doing enough tests? You mean you've taken tests away in 7, 8 and 9 and 10? What do you mean they don't do tests? How are they ever going to get a HSC? What about the HSC? And I'm deciding, you know, whether I'm going to take your kid out of the school. And we've lost kids. We've lost kids because of that fear, because of that lack of understanding of what they're... And they'll also tend to say, oh, well, I kind of understand what you're trying to do, but, you know, it's not my experience at school, so I don't like it, so it's not any good for my kid. Now, conversely, what we've found, and one of the reasons we got rid of any streaming, is that the kids who traditionally have been tailored to be in a top class and had that experience at primary school, just, you know, to pick up on your point, Jayne, have no or very little intrapersonal and interpersonal skills at all. They struggle, and the results they get with us, because this is the other point I wanted to get onto, is about the assessment of those skills. How do we assess that and how do we measure that? When we measure those students, they're not doing very well, and those parents don't like it, and that's when they pull them out. And so we're now going to pick up on what Denise is doing, I think, in a way, with the parent university concept, and we've really got to get an army of parents out there to share the news of the work and what the work does and recalibrate the thinking across the community. And it's got to be done contextualised for each community. I'm really keen to delve deeper into assessing the work.
Jayne?
Yep, sorry. I think the parents don't know what's possible unless you actually show them what's possible. So I think one of the things that stood out in my memory in our time is we had an education week, and it was around communication. So the parents traditionally would come along to education week, and there'd be a few dances and the band would play, and then they'd go to classrooms and they'd open up the books and have a look through all the books, and then the children would sit down and do an activity. So we, as a staff, decided to sit down and reimagine what education week would look like with the focus of communication. So we brought out the communication crystal, and it was all about innate agency, enabling voice, all the things that we wanted our parents to see. So we invited our parents into the classrooms. The books were away. The books never came out, and we got the parents involved with the students. So they were doing the activities with their students. So it wasn't a sit and look what's happening in the room. It wasn't a flick through the book. It wasn't a one-on-one conversation with the teacher. It was actually authentically engaging with the students, with their own children and the other students in the classroom. And that had power. And the parents were blown away with the work that we had been doing with our students about how they can communicate clearly and effectively with their friends and with their students in their class. So I think it's just reimagining, and our parents are like our staff and like our students. We need to stop putting them into categories of how am I going to get my staff on board? How am I going to get the students on the board? How am I going to get my community on board? We're all together. We're all here for our students. We're all here for the learning. So how you get your staff on board is how you get your community on board, showing them what's possible.
Denise?
Yeah, how you going? Hey, Pasi. My deputy, who's relieving in my position, because I'm doing some research because Pasi is one of my supervisors, and I'm talking to him, and we're walking along. And I'm going to this learner profile meeting, and I just want to tell. And he said, "I've got the SIP out, and I've got strategic direction 1, and we've got the targets, and we're going to line them up." And I said, "Pardon?" I actually had to say to him, "Don't even worry about that." I said, "I wrote it. I know what we're doing. We do the work. That will come. The targets will come." But I was talking to him about courage around taking away the noise. And I loved your work where you said, you went to the class and you said, I could hear that noise, but I had to focus on what I was doing. So I want to know, how do you push back and courage, and really from all the leaders here, when that the wolf's at your door, how do you push that away? Because I think there's some people on the screen that actually have got that coming at them. So just saying, that's my question. Because I walked along and I'm talking to my deputy. Yeah, don't worry about that. Don't worry about it. Just talk about the work. Get them doing the work. That's where your work is, essentially.
I think it's, if I could refer to the SIP, the big horrible word that people talk about. It's sitting in your, I know for us in our leadership meetings, we put time aside. So there are things that we have to do, the SIP, the target, but we also put really good quality time aside for our professional learning and what it looks like. And it's even just something as simple as flipping how your meetings look. So your administration, your white noise, your things that you have to do, they're at the back end of the meeting. So if we're sitting in a meeting, it starts at 9 o'clock and it ends at 1, which our leadership meetings look like. Admin starts at 12:30. Okay, so you've got half an hour, 12:30 to 1. It's amazing how quickly you can get through the white noise when you've been sitting there since 9 o'clock and you've got lunch at 1 o'clock. So I think it's strategically thinking about that is just something really simple that you could do. And I think also when we talk about the SIP, like I said before, it's actually the practice, it's the learning. I think we need to put aside the targets. The targets, like you said, will happen. No?
But what I was going to say is when I'm there, we don't do that. So what I'm saying is there's lots of middle leaders. So I would just go, we don't actually, our executive meetings, Pasi's been there, they don't look like a meeting at all. Admin can be in a bit of paper sent out.
In an email.
Absolutely. So we make it very much about noticings and people's views and agency and yada, yada. But I noticed with my deputy that he was again thinking in the box or whatever it was. And so I guess my comment is, how do you get that bravery and that courage around what you're trying to do? And that's what Pasi said in some of our schools, is that's really evident. Yet it's hard to find in some schools.
Peter, what do you reckon?
That's my question.
I'm thinking about that. I think sometimes you've got to play both, and that's the reality. We work in a system, and it's a bit, I don't fish at all, but I imagine it's like one of those fly fishing things where sometimes you allow yourself, and I think this is important, you have to notice it and you have to be aware and self-critical about it, that you go and you do your school improvement plan, or whatever other accountabilities, you set your targets with your director or whatever you're dragged in to do, because within a school, we don't have the power directly to take that on and change the system. So I've sat with my director and we've had conversations, and I've said, well, these targets, I don't agree with the focus on them, and I'm not going to be sharing that with my executive, et cetera, because that's not the important work. But at the same time, she knows and I know that I will sit down and I will work with some of the executive and we will get that job done. And it'll be done really well because it's informed by the work. But we have to, so as much as possible, in some way or other, that sits there. What we're really doing is over here. And we've just got to go through the motions. But I think it comes back to me about where you put your focus. My advice to your deputy is think about where you're going to put your focus and what's the biggest lever you can pull to make the greatest school change. Is it by completing a SIP and a target, or is it by doing this kind of work? How do you build that courage? I think in that particular case, he's in a terrible... No. Yeah, how do you do that?
I think for us, we have built a very strong community of practice. So we've got 5 schools in our neighbouring area. That courage comes from that, because that comes from instantly 5 principals at 5 completely different schools who are working with the team. And each of those schools, it looks different because no school looks the same. But I know for the principals, it gives them courage to know that they can work with other principals. We set up we've got 7 community of practice groups within our 5 schools. So we have a community of practice just for our languages team. We have a community of practice for our learning and support team. We have a community, so we bring all the learning and support team teachers from each of our 5 schools into the same space, having those really great conversations, having some ideas about vision, sharing that practice, giving them the courage, because they might hear something and think, oh, that happened at your school, that's possible. It might give them the courage to go back to their school and say, hey, I was just down the road at Carlton Public School and this is what they're doing down there, it seems to be working. Our principal would sit there and say, oh, okay, that's possible. What can it look like? Why don't you pop down there, get in their business, get in their classrooms, opening up the doors. So some people need courage through working alongside of someone, and there is so much power in a community practice. We've got most of our community practice are here with us tonight, but there are other teachers now who are not within our 5 schools of community practice who we still work with. Just because they're not in our 5 doesn't mean we don't work with them. So it's building that people around you.
I agree, but in some circumstances, of course, those other schools around you don't have the courage or aren't doing the work. And so it becomes a very lonely place as a school leader. I think that just having time to reflect and listen to what you've said, it's the collaboration within the school, sure, but at the end of the day, you're it as the leader. So you've got to come back to what's most important for the students. What's most important for the learner? What's going to get the biggest bang for the buck for that learner? And that's about your inner conviction. That's what drives my courage. I can't speak for anyone else, but it would be absolutely remiss of me to walk out of the school after 5 years, 6 years, however long I'm going to be there, and not have worked every day for the benefit of every single one of the boys and girls, even if they're incredibly dysfunctional and challenge me beyond belief. If I'm not doing that and I'm not pushing back against the things that are getting in the way of those children growing, 12 months of growth, I can use the department's language, 12 months of learning for 12 months of growth, and every student is known, valued and cared for. If we're fair income about that, then we need to push aside, pay honour to the things, the mandated things we need to do. We need to push that aside because they're the most important things. Human beings are the most important things.
All right, I'm going to bring our panel to a close in a moment because I can hear those hors d'oeuvres calling us. But Kelly Pfeiffer asked about an hour ago this question, and I thought it's a great question to finish with. If the panel members had the power, political, monetary, structural, to change one thing in education, where would they start? I'm going to start with Pasi.
Where would I start? I would start here in Australia. And you know, one thing, of course, you know, you can say many things here, but one thing I really would love to do here, and I'm saying this, my answer is based on, you know, being about 3 years here as a parent. So we have 2 kids in a public school here, and as a family and also as an educator. I would definitely make sure that each and every child would have a healthy 3-course meal served for free every single day. And I think that would make a huge difference in many of these. You know, this whole idea of transformation would be much easier when the kids are well fed, and teachers as well. You know, the school where our kids go, it's a horrendous thing to see what these little ones bring with them. It's a primary school, what they bring with them in the school. And it's even more alarming when you look at the lunchbox that comes back home, and those are exactly the things that they should have had that return back home every day. The good thing is that you can use the same carrot and apple for a week. You just put the chips and sweet water there, and that's fine. But seriously, this is definitely what I would love to do. Free healthy meal for every kid every day.
Peter?
Why don't we do that? Seriously. You know, there's nothing to stop. There's nothing to stop us doing that tomorrow. Really, we've got the funding that we could allocate to it instead of buying something. Look, I think it's leadership, leadership development. It's got to be about what Denise was saying. If we have the opportunity to develop leaders and break the old mould and give them courage and make them know it's okay to be courageous. So I think money, the one thing I would change would be that leadership development, because from there, the rest will change.
Great. Jayne?
I do like that one, but maybe I'll think of something different quickly. I think the thing that frustrates me the most in schools is, and it's with my own children as well, how was your day? What did you do? Nothing. And that statement really sits really poorly with me. If I could change anything, I would love every child to walk out of the school at the end of the day feeling that they were engaged, that they were inspired, that they had a fun day, and that someone actually listened to them. That's the sort of thing I want for the students. I just feel like we have these children in our care with us, and I just want them to walk out feeling like they've had a great day and they've been engaged and they've been inspired and they're curious, interested students. And that comes back to us, and we have that responsibility. So whether that comes from leadership, whether that comes from teachers, or comes from everywhere, but that's what we need. We need to build this love of learning in our students, because that's our job, that's our core business.
Yeah, I think there are two sort of things that I wish all students knew. I think the first one would be that they do have a voice and a really valuable perspective on their own learning journeys, their own experiences. And the second would be that learning can be so much richer. I wish they all knew how rich learning could be.
What do you mean by that, to expand on richer?
When I think the way that I've always experienced deep learning has been this feeling like my brain is expanding so much it's pressing into my skull. Because it's embodied, it's challenging what I know, it's, really deep critical thinking, but also play. And there are so many elements of learning beyond the textbook.
Well, I can't do any better than that to sum up. Can you please thank our panel?
Wow, amazing information tonight, and I can't thank you all enough for being here to launch the book, but also to share your expertise with all of us. So tonight we've been given yet another opportunity to reimagine our schools with a focus on collaboration, critical reflection, communication and creativity. We've been shown how we can sustainably transform our schools to be places of support, challenge and joy in learning, responding to students' needs and the needs of the workspaces and wider community. I would like to thank Professor Robin Ewing for sharing with us the work of the Create Centre. Thank you to Professor Pasi Sahlberg for launching Transforming Education with us tonight, and we're very privileged to have you now call Australia home. Thank you to our panellists, Peter and Jayne. Your insights and knowledge have allowed us to see how you provide your students with opportunities to have agency and voice. I'm honoured to be someone who's collaborated with you and learnt from you both, and had the pleasure of seeing what you do every day in your schools for your teachers and your students. Thank you, Leilana. Amazing. You're an exceptional example of how the work creates lifelong deep learners and passionate inquirers. I did read in your bio that you're actually a roller skater as well. And I had this fantastic line ready because I was going to read the bios and then Michael decided he was going to. And it had this whole idea about if you're not out there roller skating, you're trying to convince other people to do it. And it took me back to my velvet burgundy velvet, roller skates with the very nice white top, and I must say I was quite the expert at going backwards and around corners to some of the great music like Another One Bites the Dust by Queen. So thanks for that little memory and a little trip down my creative, not so creative, physical activities. Thank you to those behind the scenes who've made tonight happen. Your work is appreciated, and we know that events like this can't happen without you. Lastly, Miranda and Michael, on behalf of leaders, teachers, students and families across the world, I would like to thank you both for helping us reimagine our schools and transform education for those at the centre of every decision that we make in our schools, our children. You allow us space to create a vision and transform education through context-driven inquiries with frameworks to develop skills to collaborate, communicate, be creative and critically reflect on everything that we do for our learners. To those who've joined us tonight on Zoom or here at the university, thank you for joining our ever-growing team of professionals who truly believe that transformation can occur in our schools. We are brave, we are very voicey, and we will never stop advocating for our children. Don't forget, as you leave tonight, to get yourselves and every contemporary educator that you know a copy of Transforming Education, either here tonight or from Bloomsbury Publishing. Oh, and do make sure you check out page 158. Definitely worth the read. Good night, everyone, and have safe travels for those travelling home tonight.